I'm a little rattled. I didn't have time to collect my thoughts trying to find a marker that worked. But I did look from the back of the room, and you can see that now, for if you have average eyes. What do you think that number is? If you wanted to abbreviate that, you could say it's 16.9 trillion, but what do you think it represents? So it's almost $17 trillion. John? World population? Nope. U.S. debt. Specifically, it's U.S. household debt. So this is not our government's debt load, right? This is just us. So when you look at households, all the household debt, so what's household debt? What makes up household debt? Go ahead, just throw out a category. What was that? One at a time. Cars, car loans, right? That's both leases as well as loans to own the car. What else? Houses, mortgage, right? Property, credit cards. What else? Cars. Student loans, right? Student loans. What else? Medical bills, right? Utilities aren't debt, technically, right? This is just debt. What else? Which usually goes on the credit cards, right? But then you've got things like home equity loans, which are different than mortgages. Home equity line of credit. You've got personal loans, which personal loans could be, yes, you could say it's credit card, but personal loans could be like, I went to Best Buy and I bought something on their plan, which may not be technically a credit card, but it's still a debt. It could be, I owe John Christian $50,000. He says I do. He was... Okay, so 16.9 trillion. I don't know how you make sense of that number. Is that a big number? Is that a little number? I'll tell you this, it's the highest it's ever been, right? And you can track it over time. This is a 2022 number. You can see that it consistently goes up, okay? What do you think that is? Well, let's not talk about per. What do you think the median household debt is? Remember what median is. It's the number right in the middle. 50% of the population is above, 50% is below. What's that median household debt number? Including mortgage. No, not even close. 100,000, right? What you think median, right? So, but what is that number? So median household debt, what is that number? What other information do you need to understand whether that number is good, bad, or otherwise? Let me put it this way. Income, right? So, and we'll get to that in a second. So if I'm carrying $100,000 in debt, okay, my family, compared to who do I want to pick on a little bit? I'll pick on somebody young. Caleb Jones. Now, Caleb might be a secret closet millionaire, bazillionaire for all we know, right? My guess is because of his age, his income is considerably lower than mine. I'm 47. I've been in the workforce a lot longer, right? So $100,000 in debt to me might be a lot different than $100,000 in debt to somebody like Caleb, right? So just the debt number itself doesn't tell you everything. So again, as we start out some of these conversations, I'm just trying to put some numbers in your mind for you to sort of personally think about where are you at compared to some of these things. Okay, so 16.9 trillion is the household debt in the United States. On the median household debt is about 100,000. It's actually, the 2022 number was 101,915. If you actually divide that number by the rough population of the United States, you're at about $50,000 per person. All right, so get rid of medians, that's about 50, but that's for like Maddie, my 9-year-old. You know, that's for the new babies, the Levis and the Lincolns and all the little kids, because that's just a pure population number. So then you get it to households, that number changes, right? Let me just break it down a little bit. Okay, 986 billion of that is credit card debt. So out of that 1.96 trillion is credit card debt. There's about 16.9 trillion. 11.9 trillion is mortgages. 1.5 trillion, and don't add up these numbers. I took this right off of the source, so I didn't double check my math. 1.9 trillion, 1.5 trillion, is vehicle loans, which includes both leases as well as what if you're trying to purchase the vehicle. And then 1.6 trillion is student loans. Okay? So that just gives you a little bit of a breakdown. I'm trying to decide. I'm going to dive into that credit card number in just a minute. Non-mortgage debt by age. Okay, so think about your own situation. Age, that's the easy thing. Think about anything you owe outside of your home payment, your house payment, your mortgage. Some of us, that might be the only outstanding balance you have, right, is a mortgage. Some of us, that's not true. 18 to 29, outside of your mortgage, on the median is $12,871 in debt. So from 18 to 29. 30 to 39, it's $26,532. 40 to 49, it's $27,838. 50 to 59 is $23,719. 60 to 69 is $16,661. And 70 plus is $9,827. Now, we could start, what are the whys? Because the highest group is that 40 to 49, and you think about where their kids are at in college and all these sort of things. You start to put together why that might be the biggest number. All right, let's look at credit cards just for a second. This might be painful for some, fun for others. Do you know what you can look up the current average credit card interest rate is? Does anybody know what the current average? As of yesterday, it was 24. Okay, 24. So interest on a credit card loan, 24%. Roughly, in general, they're from 18 to about 24 generally. So we're sort of high right now is what the average is, 24. The average credit card debt per family right now in the United States is $6,270. Alaska, actually, on average, carries the highest at just under $8,000. Okay, so this is just credit card debt. I want to give you an idea of what that means. So $6,270 doesn't sound like a ton of money. I mean, that's not a huge loan if you think about it that way. But if you paid the minimum on the credit card, assuming the current interest rate or the average interest rate of 24, how many years do you think, if you just paid the minimum, how many years, and you didn't add to that $6,270, how many years do you think it would take to pay back that $6,270 with 24% interest rate, paying the minimum payment, which the minimum payment on that's about $188 a month, which is not a small, if you think about your monthly budget, $188 is not like, well, it's just peanuts, right? How many years? Huh? You're very close. 13 years. 13 years, and how much interest would you pay in that 13 years on that $6,270? $11,872 in interest. $11,872. So if I put a $15 pizza on my credit card, and it was part of that $6,270, by the time I paid it off, it would be about $60 pizza. Hope it was good pizza. Okay. Let's talk one more thing, and then we'll move on from this. Does anybody know what the debt-to-income ratio is?
Probably 30%.
No, not what the number is, what it is, like defining it. 30%, well, I'll get to that number. That's a good number to bring up, but I'll get to that in a second. Well, what is a debt-to-income? I'm going to ask a question here in a second, but debt-to-income ratio, does anybody know what that is? Okay, let me ask that a different way. Without, I will not pick on you, I promise. Do you think you know what it is? You're not going to have to explain it to the group. Do you think you know what debt-to-income ratio is? Okay. So we have, I would argue, less than half people raise their hand. Okay. So debt-to-income ratio is when you take your monthly expenditures and you divide it by your monthly income. Okay, so monthly expenditure, there's a point to this. Monthly expenditures like car payment, mortgage, those, not utilities, not things that fluctuate. It's the fixed monthly payments. So it's that stuff that, you got the car loan, you got the student loans, you got the home equity line of credit you got to pay on every month, you got the mortgage. Okay. It's that divided by your monthly gross income, which means before taxes. Okay, does anybody know what that number, what that number is generally used for? Credit worthiness. And specifically, most often, and that can be used in a lot of ways, but if you apply for a mortgage, they want that number to be 43% or less, generally. If your debt to income ratio is over 43%, it's going to be harder to get a mortgage, or you're going to have to get a special loan, which special loans, this always made sense to me. People who have less to pay, they're higher risk, so they have to get a higher interest rate. That makes a lot of sense, right? You're already, debt to income is a little high, so let's just throw on a loan with a higher interest rate than the person with great credit, okay? To your point, financial advisors generally say you want your debt to income to be around 30%. You get above that 43 to 45%, you start getting into like danger levels, okay? Because think about that. That's just the fixed payments. That doesn't include your gas money, your grocery money, your utilities, right? So if let's say 45% of your income is just the monthly payments on your car and your house and your home equity line of credit, your student loans, that doesn't leave a ton for all that other stuff that comes up, especially your Amazon bill that comes due because you did a little late night shopping, right? Okay. So let me back up. So that's just a little bit. So first of all, does anybody, I don't want you to raise your hand, I'm just going to ask this question. Does anybody right now know what approximately your debt to income ratio is? There's a few head nods. I would argue most don't. And I would say that based on hands, less than 50% of us even knew what that term really meant. Okay? Now let me ask this question. Maybe I should ask this at the beginning. How many people, and you can raise your hand if you want, but you don't have to, just think about it. How many people have had any kind of formal education, either from their parents or from schooling or from a mentor, to run them through basic household finances? Got a few hands. This is one of the strangest things. I'm a finance major, right? And my dad sort of trained us as kids. I can remember, even though I was only 11 when he passed, I still remember him walking me through how this worked. That phrase, and he didn't invent it, but you remember the phrase, and this isn't always true, but there's two kinds of people in the world. Those who understand interest and collect it, and those who don't and pay it, which is not a hard and fast. It rolls off the tongue, but there's always exceptions. But the finances are one of the things that we very rarely do we consistently get education on. We're just sort of left to figure it out. Okay, and I bring that up to say this. We're going to be talking about debt, Lord willing, today and then next Wednesday, or this coming Wednesday. And our relationship with money and then therefore debt can be all over the place. And what I mean by that is some of us have been trained and been taught very, very intentionally how money works, right? And so we were taught to budget, we were taught to think about what's coming in and what's going out, and needs versus wants and all these things. And some of us, I would say the majority of us, were just sort of like, welcome to the world. One of the things that I always found very interesting was when I was like an 18-year-old kid on Purdue's campus, so right out of high school. And I'm riding my bike around campus trying to get to class, and just on a 10-minute bike ride, I would see multiple, at least 3 or 4 tables set up with free t-shirts. And what did you have to do to get a free t-shirt? Apply for a credit card. Bunch of 18-year-old kids don't even know how to balance a checkbook. For you younger people, a checkbook is this thing that... And yet, they're handing out credit cards, okay? So my point for all of that is I don't want this portion of our stewardship class to be something that just starts to fill you with shame, right? Because you never were taught or understood. Now, that's not an excuse for continuing in habits that are destructive or habits that are ungodly, habits that are putting you and your family in a deeper hole financially. That's not my point of, don't feel bad, it's all. But I don't want this to be, I'm so stupid, I'm so dumb, look what I did to myself, look what I did to our family, look. you are not alone in making and in being an uneducated person in this world, just going about making money and spending money and not really having a good foundation for going, okay, how does this stuff work? So let's talk about debt. All right, so there's sort of laying the foundation. What is the concern? What is the concern about personal debt? As a Christian, think about stewardship, what we've been talking about. What would be some concerns about personal debt? Jeremy Appleton? Yeah. And so I'm going to take as many comments as I can, and then I'm going to get to that one especially in just a little bit. So Jeremy said, you can't bless others if your head's underwater because of personal debt. Okay? And we're going to explore that in a minute. What other concerns are there about personal debt and being a steward, one of God's stewards? John?
It can enslave you.
Yeah, it can enslave you, and we're going to get to that as well. It can enslave you, which is one of the ways it's hard to bless others, right? Because all of your attention and your energy is spent on this debt. Steve?
There's a temptation to not give if you can prosper. So if debt, you don't have extra money or money. Just as a temptation not to give.
Yeah, so it's interesting. What was an Old Testament or a old law principle? We hear this. There's this principle God had about giving your first fruits, right? And it's interesting when you go back, and we might explore that Wednesday night. We might not. I haven't completely decided where we're going, and Jeff's teaching for me, so all this could be mute. He might just go a whole different way. But this idea of giving first to God, this faith giving, right, where it's like, okay, He's going to take care of me, that becomes a lot harder when I've mounted up debt to where I'm paycheck to paycheck or even beyond paycheck to paycheck, and where I'm just barely trying to keep things afloat. I'm robbing from this account to pay this account and robbing from this one to pay this one, and it's like floating. Right? That's a lot harder. It goes into 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. Remember when Paul wrote to the Corinthians about their previously promised bountiful gift? And he said to go ahead and take it up before I get there. What was one of his reasons? He said so that it not be affected by covetousness. The idea is that you promise this, and if you wait to the last minute to prepare for this giving that you promised, then all of a sudden what comes into your head? When John Wilcox walks in and says, Andy, remember you promised to give this, and I'm going, oh yeah, what do I think of? I don't think about, oh yeah, here's that money I promised. I think about this bill and this bill and this debt and this debt. Right? And so when you've mounted up this debt that you're struggling to gain control of or to even manage, that kind of first fruits giving becomes a real challenge. It becomes a real test of faith. Okay, what else? So we've talked about being able to bless. We talked about being enslaved to it, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. The whole idea of giving as you've been prospered. Mary? Conflict. Okay, did you know, and I didn't look this statistic up. This is from probably 10 years ago of a finance class I taught. It used to be that one of the top 5 reasons for divorce, in fact, it used to be almost always cited as number 1. One of the top 5 reasons for divorce had financial matters at its base, where there was either compiling debt or there was spending out of control or both. And that became such a point of friction, right? Why is that? Why does that cause conflict? I mean, this is a dumb question. Don't overthink this. This is a very simple question. Why does financial stress or financial problems cause stress in the home?
Because one partner wants to go one way and one wants to go another. They have 2 separate goals.
Well, and oftentimes that's what leads to it, right? Is if you come from a background where you were raised to be very cheap, I won't sugarcoat it. You were raised to be really cheap, where it was like we're gonna get. You don't throw that bread sack away. My grandma never threw that bread sack away. When she died, we took out like 3,000 bread sacks out of the closet. But hey, you always had a bread sack. Although I did try to, Stephen cut his finger and had it all taped up, and I tried to put a bread sack on it so he could go to the shower, and Christine was like, oh, that's gross, it's got germs in it. My grandma used them. What was I talking about? But if you have two different approaches, right, that can cause it, but then that can also continue when there's then the financial burden, the stress, and it's week to week or month to month type of financial situations, and creditors are calling, or it's just all of a sudden that just is exasperated. Peter?
That's more or less what I was going to say, is that I know that we're supposed to trust God in all things, but it's really is financial security. If one of the partners is just spending out of control or gambling or destroying their financial future.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. Jeremy, you had your hand up.
I'm just going to allude to
No, good.
the divorce thing.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. There's one other thing that I got listed. So debt. Why do we need to be concerned about it, especially as you were thinking about stewardship as a Christian? So we've talked about being enslaved to it. We've talked about it, you're inhibiting your ability to bless others. We've talked about the relationships in the home and the friction it can cause and the problems. We talked about lessening your ability to, or your inhibiting your giving of, as you've been prospered, that idea of first fruits, right? There's one other thing at least that I think is important to consider when we talk about debt. Gerald, is that a hand or a scratch? Did you say content? That's where I want to start. Contentment. Okay, so I want to clarify first of all. If you right now are struggling with debt, that doesn't always mean you're somebody who lacks contentment. Okay, I think often, and just quick, I've also been a financial advisor as well and worked people through. In my experience, very often when there's a big debt problem, there is a lack of contentment that has led to that. However, there are also circumstances far outside of our control. There's one lady back when I was in college and we were counseling for free. She was a professor at Purdue, and she got diagnosed. Well, let me back up real quick. Me and my fellow junior, who are, all of 20 years old, are going to help this woman. It's free counseling, and she comes in with a shoebox full of bills, and 80% of them hadn't even been opened. Okay, and immediately you start getting judgy with that, like, whoa. Well, it turns out this woman had been a professor at Purdue, making a good living. Everything had been fine. She got diagnosed with cancer, a brain tumor that was most likely going to kill her. She very quickly stopped worrying about paying bills. And before long, she wasn't able to do her job. And so she took a much lower paying administrative job, and she started adding to the credit card because life is very short for her. And then lo and behold, guess what happens? The operation works. And then she's left with this pile of bills, right? And I'm not saying she made good choices, but you start to go, I sort of understand from a compassionate standpoint how that happens, right? So my point is it's not just that you want what somebody else has got or you're not content with your standard of living, blah, blah, blah. That, having said that, I think that's something we have to consider when we talk about debt. Go ahead and turn to 1 Timothy chapter 6. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Well, don't turn to that one. Turn to Hebrews 13. 1 Timothy chapter 6, remember what it is. Paul says, godliness with contentment is great gain. We brought nothing into this world. We're not taking anything out. If we have what, we should be content. And 1 Timothy 6, from your memory, do you remember? If we have food and covering, right, we should be content. Okay, so that's sort of like the level of, okay, if you got food in your belly and you got clothes on your back, then you should be content. That's a hard standard, right? Hebrews 13. Somebody read Hebrews 13:5. Whoever got there with the nice loud voice.
Keep your life free from the love of money. Be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you.
Keep yourself, your character, your life free from the love of money, being content with what you have, for he himself has said, I will never leave you, I will never desert you or leave you, nor will I forsake you. Be content with what you have, be free from the love of money. Okay? Notice it's interesting that the Hebrew writer connects that idea of contentment and not being full of this love of money with God's care. Right? And so there's this lack of contentment, which also could be a reflection of our lack of trust or faith in God as well. Okay, so we know that these are not new passages, right? We understand that we as Christians, God expects us to be content, and honestly, the standard is food and clothing. Like you get in your daily, and the idea, I don't want you to like take that 1 Timothy passage and let's dissect, well, what's food and clothing? The idea is your basic needs. Be content with your basic needs, okay? Trust that God's going to take care of you, okay? Go ahead and quickly turn over to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and I'm going to do what I always tell you not to do. We're just going to pull this right out of its context. Ecclesiastes 5, verse 10. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. Okay, let's move. What is Solomon? What is his point? What's the main nugget that we take away from Ecclesiastes? And he says this in different ways regarding different things. But what's his point about those who love money? Jeremy? Yeah, it's not going to bring, you're never going to be fulfilled with it. Right? So if you're relying on that for fulfillment, there's always going to be more that you want, more that you want. There was a study that was done, and I should have looked this up, but it was interesting that they were trying to decide, does money bring you happiness? And there was a real serious increase in happiness with additional income. What do you think at what level? At what level do you think, was it going from $1 million income to a $2 million income? Was it going, what do you think income level, what area of the spectrum, what range of the spectrum do you think actually showed a very obvious increase in happiness? Poverty, John?
That seemed like I would think a simple thing. It seemed like it's like, oh, like 50 to 100,000 or in that kind of a range.
They said around 75 to 85,000 is when it sort of plateaued, the happiness. And the idea, as they dug into that research, was when you're struggling to get your basic needs met, and you get income to help you cover those basic needs without all the stress and the, working 2 jobs, working 3 jobs, all these sort of things, and, trying to just make it work, then additional income and getting past that actually does increase your happiness. But as soon as those basic needs are sort of taken care of, there is no correlation with an increase in income. You can go from $100,000 a year to $300,000 a year, and there was no correlation to increasing your happiness, right? You could keep reading on in Ecclesiastes, but the idea is so we have this expectation, this command to be content, right? We have this command to be content, to trust in God, to be content. And we also have this idea that chasing, and when I say money, don't just think about dollars and cents, don't just think it's stuff, right? Because you want the money because the money's going to buy you the boat. And if you just get the boat, you're going to be happy, right? It's the stuff, chasing the stuff. But we have this command, expectation as Christians to be content with what we have, food and covering, the basic needs, and we'll be content with that, trust in God. And we have these warnings against chasing after, well, if I just get this, things will be different. If I can just do, things will be different. Right? Additionally, you've got like Luke chapter 12, verse 15, which we've read in previous classes, where the person says, hey, Jesus, tell my brother to split my inheritance. I think it was brother. Tell my brother to split the inheritance. And Jesus, remember what he warns them? He says, protect yourself against every form of greed. Because even when somebody has an abundance, his life doesn't consist of his possessions. Okay, so let's just think about this for a second. We talked about this number. We talked about the average household debt is around $100,000. Credit card, just one piece of that is about $6,200, roughly. Think about your situation. Think about maybe what's led to some of the debt you have. How often does a lack of contentment very subtly play into us choosing to take on more debt? For example, What house do I buy? What decisions go into the house that you buy? Yeah, it's a question. No, it's, hey, you take the opportunity. What decisions go into the house that we buy? Can we afford the payment? Family growth, right? What else? Location, right? Commute. Size, right? Which could be connected to the family growth as well. Schools. Right? There's all sorts of decisions. I'm not saying good or bad. Those are all good, and as the most part. There's also could be, what does my friend live in? What does my brother and sister, kind of house do they have? What kind of neighborhood? How subtly does the status symbol, the comfort level, there's all sorts of terms, but start to play into, yeah, well, if we just go a little bit bigger. You know what? Yeah, we got it. This is always hilarious. When we moved here, do you know what I was approved for? Do you know what I was approved for? Like $1.2 million for a house. I'm like, what am I going to eat? We can live there with no furniture, wearing the same clothes for the next 30 years, and pretty much eat rice and beans, right? So it's funny, right? You get approved for such a... Has anybody had that experience, regardless of the number, where you got approved for a number that not in your life? Not only would you not feel comfortable taking on that loan, you know your own finances, and you see that payment, and you're like, what math are they using? This is terrifying that our financial institutions would give me that kind of money, right? But what happens is, okay, we've got that, let's just say 500,000 we're approved, but yet we know that 300,000 is about where it is. But for 350, for 400, and I'm not judging every little decision. That's not my point. My point is, how does so-and-so just bought this house and they've got this. Or so-and-so's in this neighborhood, or, when I grew up, this was the house. Right? All of a sudden, what about cars? Let's apply the same contentment or lack thereof to cars. How does it play out in that? This is a question, Rita, just for clarity. How does that play out in decisions about buying cars? How it looks, the features that it has, whether it has the leather, the name brand, because there's certain, you could have the exact same feature, and this isn't probably completely accurate, and I'm not trying to be insulting, but you could have the same features in a Kia that you have in a Mercedes. Yes, we're going to argue about the engineering and the quality, blah, blah, blah. That's not my point. But you could have the same basic features, meaning it drives from A to B and it has air conditioning, as the Mercedes, but we're going to pay so much more because of the name and the recognition and the status symbol of the Mercedes, right? So we've had that. There's another big thing that comes into buying cars. I've seen this with a lot of individuals. What is another big piece of the cars that we buy? Fuel. Oh, how boring. You're right, but boring. It's actually very true. Speaking of, I've been blessed to drive a company car for the last 15 years. I don't even remember last time I looked at what the cost of gas was. It's just terrible, right? I just pull in, fill up, right? Fuel economy. What about, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. Does anybody really, once their car's year model is a little older, once they start to see that same brand and same model and it looks nicer, and sometimes it's just the newness of it. I know some individuals that they only lease because every 2 to 3 years they want a new car. And it has nothing to do with better fuel economy or their car isn't working right, or it's just that they can't stand to have an outdated model. Okay? We can do the same thing with phones. I know people that will stand in line for days, that might be an exaggeration, hours and hours and hours to get it used to be the new iPhone. I don't know what's the hot thing now. This thing's like 6 years old. But it's not because the old phone didn't work. It's just, I want the newest thing, right? And I'm not, I hope I'm not sounding critical. I'm trying to get us to think about how our minds are affected and what influences us. If we wanted to boil it down, and this applies to me, this probably applies to most of you, could we do with a smaller, less expensive house? could we do with a cheaper car? Could we do with... Now, I'm not saying that the decision to go a little more expensive was sinful. Don't hear what I'm not saying. But it's those kind of decisions that pile up until all of a sudden, between the house and the car, and then what we put on the credit card because we didn't have the cash to pay for it, but we wanted it now, all of a sudden we start to build up a debt load that becomes something that's not easily manageable. And then anytime we take on debt like that, when I take on a car loan, a mortgage, let's say student loans for my kids, let's say I got that, what do they call that, 60 days or 90 days, same as cash for that furniture that I wanted, where, hey, I'm not going to pay interest for it because as long as I pay it off in 90 days. What are we assuming when we take on those things? What are we assuming? We can pay it off, and what's that assuming? Assuming that I'm going to be alive, able to work, and still employed at least at the same level I am when I made the decisions to take on the debt. All right? Now, here's the thing. These kind of decisions, what car I get and whether I go with the bare minimum that I need so that the payment or the cost is as low as possible, or whether I have a tendency to go as high as I possibly can. I love this tactic. I used to love buying cars. I used to, because you could haggle, and I love haggling. I know some of you people, as soon as I talk about haggling over a car, you fear boils up in you, and the thought of it just makes you sweat. I loved haggling. I cannot stand buying cars now because they don't haggle anymore. In fact, I will find the dealership that will haggle just because I like that whole process. But what I can remember years and years ago, I remember the first questions, and this is just about every dealership, and I think it's still true. They'll come up and they'll say, all right, how much do you have for a down payment? What do you want your monthly payment to be? Those are the questions they ask. And then they go in with their wizard magic, they figure out how to get you into a much more expensive car for that down payment and that low monthly payment. And they don't even tell you what the interest rate is or the fact that it's going to take you 18,000 years to pay it off. Right? But the idea is that we've got to start thinking about the decisions, the intentional decisions we make when it comes to these things and what's driving them. Some of it could just be that that's how my parents always did it. They always had car loans, they always had mortgages, they always had this, and we always drove nice cars, and we always had a nice house. And so that's just what you expect, and so therefore you max out what you could do. Because here's the thing, do lenders care generally about your financial well-being? Only to the point to where can they get enough money out of you, right? Which Wednesday, potentially we might look at sort of God's look on those things. God's look about how to lending money, because it's interesting when you read what God says to his own people. But what is the mindset that's driving our decisions? Because a lot of times those things are just happening without us stopping and thinking, is this being driven from a lack of contentment? Is this being driven by wanting to keep up or wanting to be perceived or because of my peer group has this or those sort of things? Quickly, and that 5-minute bell just scared me. Real quick on this as well. Ephesians 4, I'm going to run through these really quickly. Ephesians 4:28. Remember, Paul says, let him who steals steal no longer, but work. And what's the point? Work so you can pay your bills? Work so you can have something to share with those who are in need. So intent of work is not just covering my expenses. He says working so that you can have something to share. Titus 2:11 through 3, verse 1 talks about how God redeemed us to be a people of good works. I'm really paraphrasing, so you want to look that up. But in chapter 3, verse 1 of Titus, he says, people ready for every good deed. Let's get to this real quickly. So I'm going to quote this. This is what John talked about. Proverbs 22:7. The slave is the borrower is the slave of the lender. It's not just about not having the financial resources to do good work. What happens when you're drowning in debt? Every moment is spent managing that. Second jobs, more hours at work, all of us. What happens to your ability when you're having to work and put more work into maintaining this debt load that we've created for ourselves? What happens to our time, our ability to do good deeds, not just financially, but our ability to take away from just managing this debt to, okay, so-and-so needs help. I'm going to be able to do that. John?
And it's going to affect your mind. You're going to be dwelling on that whether you like it or not. It's going to be in the back of your mind if you're so burdened.
Yeah, and thank you, John. So it's not just the physical time that I take away from being able to do other things so that I can have the job to help just make the payments. But if anybody's ever been in a financially or currently in a financially debt burden situation, it's always there, isn't it? It's always that voice, that worry, that concern, which then bleeds into every relationship, every conversation.
In your relationship with God, you're not dwelling on Him.
Exactly. It becomes a preoccupation, right? So real quickly, what we've done is you think about whatever your situation is, you think about what's driving that. You think about, is there a lack of contentment? Is there this worldly, I need to be, I expect to, I want to look like, putting on the same kind of airs that I see others around me? And then there's also this, how does it impact my ability to do good work? To do good deeds, to be a support, to be an encouragement, to be a valuable worker in the kingdom, right? It gets into that. So the point of this morning's class is to just get our minds thinking, okay? So first and foremost, do you even know your situation? Do you know your situation? Do you know what you are obligated to pay every month compared to your income? Do you know your debt-to-income ratio? I'm more than happy to help you if that intimidates you, just figuring that out. But do you even know that your situation? And then after knowing your situation, have we analyzed sort of the attitudes that have put us in that situation, that are driving that? Right? To not just spend, not just pull out the credit card, because that's the usual mode of operation, but to stop and think, why am I purchasing this on credit? Why do I need this? What is the motivation for this? Is there something lacking that I'm trying to fill up with this as opposed to seeking it through God? Right? So that's the next part. And then, and I would even say, do you know your triggers, your temptations? Because we didn't even get into that. There's a whole psychology to spending. Where you have some people who they deal with stress by eating. That's more of my thing. You have some people who might pour themselves into video games for stress. You have some people who spend for stress. Right? Think through that. And then finally, third, so know your situation. Do you know your situation? Do you know what's driving it? Do you know the triggers? What's behind that? And then third, do you need help? Do you need advice? Maybe you've never been trained. Maybe you've never been taught. Do you need help? Do you need counsel? Because getting out of debt is often a lot like losing weight. We always are drawn to the easy, fast way. But losing weight takes self-control and effort. Getting out of debt also takes self-control and effort. Okay. Now, Lord willing, on Wednesday, like I said, Jeff's going to teach. I think we want to explore a little bit of God's view towards these things, as well as just explore the question, should a Christian even have debt, right? Because I know there's some, especially when you think about a specific passage in Romans, should a Christian even have debt? And then finally, if there's time, I would like Jeff to address, what about bankruptcy? Okay, is that something a Christian could consider? Okay, so I'm not putting anything too controversial on Jeff's plate. All right, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.